Hi, welcome to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining podcast, where we explore the trade-offs, complexities, and ethical dilemmas shaping the energy transition. I'm your host, Eric Young, a researcher with an interest in the supply chains and critical minerals that power our world and the decisions that we face in getting those minerals to consumers. Today, I'm speaking with Elyse Hauser, a journalist whose work on deep sea mining brings nuance to a topic that is often only superficially covered by media. Elyse is the creator of Notes from the Deep, a newsletter where she covers many aspects of the deep ocean. I especially like her newsletter because it provides a wide context on the deep sea mining question that helps me put the headlines from the other media into context. My goal for this conversation is to bring Elyse's journalistic lens into dialogue with the questions I have encountered as a researcher. I've spoken with many actors in the deep sea mining space who feel misunderstood and misrepresented by the media, and I'm looking forward to getting Elyse's take on how it is from kind of the other side of the curtain. I was first exposed to Elyse when she gave a presentation on what research scientists could learn from the way that journalists look at deep sea mining questions. This podcast is interested in the narratives and in the details that the narratives include and those that they leave out. So I'm looking forward to hearing Elyse give her thoughts on the narratives shaping the deep sea mining debate. What gets amplified, what gets left out, and why. Okay, so Elyse, let's start with your story. Can you tell how you came to be a journalist focusing on deep sea mining?
Yeah. So my background as a writer was actually in marketing, which is something that I realized only while doing it was extremely unethical and getting worse. Kind of the 21st century type of marketing that writers do, where it's maybe an ad that looks like an article, but it's dropping in products. I won't get too deep into it, but I just felt that even though it was fairly easy work and stable income, it was making me very unhappy and contributing to these global problems of waste and misinformation and things that I'm against, and I was against. So I decided to refocus. I refocused through a Master of Fine Arts degree focused in creative nonfiction, which is from the University of New Orleans. And so in doing that process of, just exploring writing and my other career options, I realized that one, journalism is one of the few other career options there are for a writer aside from marketing, and you can teach other people writing, but there's not that many viable careers. I can't just say I'm going to be a best-selling novelist. So journalism made a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to me, just the idea of taking something and explaining it in writing. I kind of love that. I love nonfiction and figuring out how to tell a true story in an interesting and meaningful way. And I, too, in that process, I also realized that I had this love for environments, especially aquatic environments. Coming from Seattle, that's where I was born and grew up. That's on the Pacific Northwest coast of the United States. It's actually on a fjord, so there's that kind of geological commonality with Norway. And, the aquatic environments, I was basically raised between two big lakes, and then Puget Sound, which is the fjord, is right there. And there's, fishing and digging for clams and harvesting mussels and oysters. All these things are kind of part of my life. And so I realized that, it doesn't need to just be a casual interest. I can actually write about this, learn about this, teach people about this through my writing. And that's a career path. And of course, I wasn't immediately thinking of deep sea mining. I probably first encountered deep sea mining through one of the bigger articles in a big publication that was published a few years back. Like there was one in The Guardian, I think it was in 2021. It was called Race to the Bottom, the disastrous blindfolded rush to mine the deep sea, which is, I think now maybe a bit of a hyperbolic title, but a pretty good article and certainly a title that people are going to click on. And, hearing this thing called deep sea mining, hearing about this thing, it just fascinated me. It sounds very science fictional. There's nothing quite like it that has been done in terms of, other forms of extraction. There's a really interesting physicality to it. It's going to a place and doing a thing, and you can visualize, you can see the machines that are going to do it. You can see the place where it's going to be done. And so as a writer, as a nonfiction writer, that's very compelling to me because people want to see interesting things when they read and go to interesting places. And deep sea mining very much does that. And I realized that it wasn't being covered very much in the media. There were a few big kind of explainer articles here and there, but there wasn't a lot of nuance or depth. There really weren't just that many articles on it at all. I think there's more now, but there's still not a lot considering kind of the magnitude of the topic. And so I've just been kind of carving out my own space in terms of covering deep sea mining as a journalist.
So it was both that the topic strongly appealed to you and that you saw kind of niche available, that
Yes.
there was scope for someone to focus. And is it like, do you focus mostly on deep sea mining? It seems to me like you take actually just a broad, you focus on all aspects of the deep sea. So do you think of yourself as all of these things relate to deep sea mining, and it's deep sea mining that you're focused on as a journalist, or do you think of it as the deep sea just kind of broadly?
Yeah. I mean, as a journalist who needs to work, I really write pretty broadly about aquatic environments in general. If there's an interesting story and it has nothing to do with deep sea mining, and a paper or magazine wants it, I will cover it. But in terms of my newsletter, for example, I do cover things that I feel are related to deep sea mining from a pretty broad lens. So I follow new research studies on the deep sea, and sometimes the authors of the study will mention, oh, this is relevant to deep sea mining because this environment could be impacted. And so I might write about that study, be like, oh, here's what scientists discovered. The new way of life, for example, when they discovered tube worms and other life forms living under the hydrothermal vents and not just on and around them. It's not directly about deep sea mining, but because those are potential mining sites, I think it's relevant and I think it's interesting. And of course, I want to inform readers, but I also want to get readers' attention and make it interesting and not just kind of cover the debates at the International Seabed Authority or in various governments that are a little bit dry and kind of removed from the physicality of it all.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, one of the things that stands out always about deep sea mining is that we know so little. I mean, this is this talking point that we know so little about the deep ocean. And so it's great to read your Substack and get all of these other aspects of the deep ocean environment that are, just kind of, like you say, left out of the normal pieces on deep sea mining. Yeah. So then when you started working on deep sea mining, did you come to it with, I guess, like an expectation or a narrative around what it was going to be like? And has your understanding or your expectation changed in the time you've been covering this?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly learned, and I'm always learning how very complex the topic is. How, there's the kind of international perspective of countries and companies wanting to mine in the international waters, but also the perspectives in Norway, Japan, various other countries that are exploring mining in their own waters. And those are very different stories. There's different types of deep sea mining. There's polymetallic nodules, seamounts, and hydrothermal vents, or, they have technical terms like seafloor massive sulfides. I usually just say hydrothermal vent because I want it to be easy for people to understand. But all of these different types of mining in different places under different government systems, it really is complicated. And I kind of think you can't even do a simple explainer article the way maybe you could a few years ago, because it's always getting more complicated. And also realizing that, there's no kind of simple two-sided debate around it. I think it's often framed that way. I think journalism has a tradition of going, here's one side and here's the opposing side. And I have learned that that's generally not the case in deep sea mining. I see a lot of framing in articles that's kind of something along the lines of mining companies want to mine the deep sea and scientists oppose it. And that has not been my experience, that scientists, widely or universally oppose it or even are interested in taking a stance. I think most scientists are interested in getting more information, not in directly opposing deep sea mining or anything like that. So yeah, it's always a learning experience, and it mostly just gets more complicated. And it's, it's not a two-sided debate. It's maybe an 11-sided debate or something like that, which is a challenge for journalists, but I like the challenge.
Yeah, that two-sided debate framing, certainly it seems that way to a lot of people initially coming to certainly how it seemed to me when I first kind of got involved with it. Mm-hmm. And it's still hard for me kind of not to frame things that way. And when I'm interviewing someone, kind of have a habit of asking them, well, what do you think about the people on the other side of the debate?
Yeah.
And yeah, often that's just not an appropriate question because people don't take a side and there's more sides, like you say. But you didn't get into it with a kind of a firebrand, like, I want to get out there and stop deep sea mining, or you didn't have a strong opinion
I mean,
coming in?
perhaps I did. Perhaps I still do. I mean, I'm an environmental journalist, which means that I care about the environment. It'd be very hard to not care about the environment. But I don't think that being incredibly oppositional or kind of activist is a useful way to go about it. I think it's an important and interesting conversation, and I have connections with people at various deep sea mining companies, and I enjoy talking to them. I don't want to necessarily argue with them or something like that. I want to learn from them and learn why they're doing what they're doing and, why they think it's the right thing to do. I think generally, in my personal opinions, I question resource extraction and use in the modern way. And deep sea mining is, of course, part of that conversation, the kind of ramping up of things like AI and digital technology and all of these things that are discussed as necessities. But I don't necessarily personally believe they're necessities. I don't even think that, a smartphone and a laptop are a necessity. They certainly weren't 20 or 30 years ago. And so I do think it's important to kind of recognize the metaphorical water that we swim in and really question that, and to be aware as a journalist of my own opinions is valuable because I don't want them to be a part of every article. So I think that it's important to have a space, and that's, in part what my newsletter is for, where I can do the op-ed thing and express my opinions and explain why I have them and have that outlet. So I'm not just kind of repressing all the time.
Okay, well, yeah. So, so I had a question on that, but I guess so I'm a researcher working in a research organization and doing a PhD related to deep sea mining. And I'm very interested to get from you the news media perspective on how this information is getting kind of disseminated to the public. So maybe we can go there and you can tell me just your perception of how deep sea mining is covered kind of journalistically. I don't know if like mainstream media makes sense as a kind of term to someone who's in media. It's something that gets thrown around a lot. So I was going to ask, what are the biggest gaps in the way mainstream media covers deep sea mining? But I guess maybe you could tell us if you think of mainstream media versus other media as relevant categories, and then how you see deep sea mining being kind of covered.
Yeah. I mean, the media categories are kind of breaking down, where we still have the mainstream media because they are the bigger papers that have funding. And so many of the small alternative ones have closed. And so now the alternative is, I think, people with Substack newsletters, or, there's kind of the news outlets of things like environmental nonprofits that aren't maybe traditional news, but they're a kind of alternative. So that space is also a lot more complicated, but there is still a mainstream media. And I think some of the smaller outlets kind of echo what's in the mainstream media. There's a lot of rehashing, I think, in, the smaller papers and newsletters and things like that.
Is that like a budget thing? Like the mainstream has the funding to do the on the ground reporting, and some of the other smaller outlets can only do so much of that. And if they want to have broad coverage, then they also just have to do their reporting from,
Yeah, exactly. Like the New York Times can send someone to the International Seabed Authority's latest meeting and cover it live. And then, a lot of smaller outlets are just kind of borrowing from their coverage and remixing it into their own articles, which is totally understandable. Not everyone can do boots on the ground reporting. As a freelancer, I certainly struggle to fund it for myself. But that does result in, I think, a lot of gaps being replicated and kind of never filled because the coverage is ultimately coming from a limited number of sources. So I'll give an example of the way these gaps play out, because I think just kind of neglecting the bigger picture context is the biggest issue that I see in a lot of this coverage. So I see a phrase along the lines of, societies need the minerals found in the deep sea to transition away from oil and gas, in many, many articles, some version of that. And it's a statement that kind of breaks down when you examine it. I mean, first, there's this idea that societies need, which is incredibly vague. I mean, which societies and what do they need them for? Maybe we can say that public transit with electric buses is a need. but a VR headset probably isn't. And so I think the lack of specificity is a problem. It also hinges on the assumption that deep sea mining companies are going to sell to renewable energy products, which they probably will, some, but we don't yet know that that's going to be their biggest source of revenue. I know that, for example, the metals company, one of the kind of very vocal deep sea mining companies, predicted in an earnings call recently that steelmaking would probably be a big demand source for them, possibly even bigger than electric vehicles. So I think we can't really assume exactly what the minerals will be used for when they're sold, if it gets to that point of commercial deep sea mining. And then
can I jump in? Because that's actually very close to my research interests. It is very difficult to find out where the minerals that go into any end use product are coming from. If you wanted to make an electric vehicle using only sustainably sourced minerals, even if you knew where those came from, even if you knew what you meant by sustainably sourced, you wouldn't necessarily be able to track upstream to where those minerals came from. It's much more difficult than for bananas or some of these other things that we're kind of used to having conscious consumer labels. And then there's that question. I mean, minerals they're kind of inherently fungible.
It's really an important angle that, because we're talking about gaps in media coverage, it's very rarely covered in these articles, the actual possible uses for these minerals, and also kind of even interrogating the idea of an energy transition, which is not something there's space for in every article, but right now it's an energy addition. The world is not reducing emissions, but it is building EVs and solar panels and all these other things. And so I like to just kind of solve that by being very specific. I'm not going to, go through all of these issues in the article, but I might just say, these minerals can be used to build electric car batteries and smartphone touchscreens and military weapons, instead of making these kind of vague and sweeping statements about the possible dream world in which they're put towards good uses that, solve things.
I guess, especially as a journalist, you've really got a limited amount of attention of your readers that you can communicate things. So if it's a complicated question like this, you've got to triage what you try to get across in terms of the context.
Yeah. And I do think being more specific holds readers' attention better. If you're like, society and decarbonization, they're not really grasping anything. That might not mean anything to your average reader. But if you're like, battery for an electric car and a smartphone, now they know what that is. They can picture it, they can imagine how it feels, and it's just a better way to captivate readers.
Absolutely. Do you have more examples of the media narratives that you see coming from the general media debate around deep sea mining?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots. And another thing that I see a lot is kind of this very clear awareness that deep sea mining companies have marketing and PR and all of that. But I don't see the same awareness of the marketing and PR from the environmental organizations. A group like Greenpeace does PR just as much as the metals company. And I do see journalists interrogating the PR from the metals company, but not the PR from Greenpeace, for example. And I think it's important to remember that both, if I'm going to say sides, I guess those are two sides of the debate, and they are both narratives. They're both presenting research, and sometimes in misleading ways. They have a specific narrative. Each of those sides has a specific narrative to present, and I think a journalist should really be critically examining all of the PR narratives in the conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's one of the things that I hear when I speak with people kind of in the industry side, is they feel that's one of the big frustrations that they feel from the media is the lack of, I don't know, scrutiny is probably the right word in their minds, of the environmental organization.
Yeah.
So, okay, so those are kind of two media gaps. Do you have any particular aspect of deep sea mining that you are most interested in? Or does that just kind of change depending on which project you're working on at the time?
Yeah. I mean, I think I mentioned earlier, physicality. And I think that is still the part that holds the most fascination for me, is kind of like, what are the machines that can do this? How do they work? Where are they going to go? What are the environments where they would be used? I'm generally drawn in that direction versus in the kind of policy debate direction. For better or worse. I mean, it's harder to cover a policy debate in an interesting way. And they're also quite important, the nuances of the ISA, International Seabed Authority meetings and things like that. But that's not kind of the appeal of it for me. So I try to balance, what's interesting and what draws me, and hope that that's going to be interesting and draw other people in, thinking about these places and the physical aspects. But I try to balance that with the need to cover the kind of blander policy side of things and, stay informed on that.
I feel like that's it. I imagine that it's best to write about the things that you find interesting also, because I'm sure that there are people who find the policy debate much more interesting than the physicality of the details. It certainly seems like that. Like you say, that's the part that gets quite a lot of coverage.
Right.
So,
it might be because I'm also a creative writer. I consider myself a writer, not just a journalist, and I do different types of writing, and I have what is technically a creative writing degree. And so I'm thinking about the scene, that I can write, and the sensory kind of excitement of it. And so maybe that's why I go in that direction.
That makes sense. Okay, so can I take you now to that presentation that you gave at the University of Bergen, which you were presenting to a room full of researchers on how, to my memory, it was what they could essentially learn from the way that a journalist looks at the same same topics. And I mean, sometimes as a researcher, I really feel like the line drawing between what journalists do and what we do is kind of just that we're doing the same thing in different buildings. Like as a journalist, you're doing research, you're writing about it, you're trying to communicate it. That's exactly the same thing that I'm doing. I'm often even kind of thinking, wow, I wish I had taken some journalism courses so that I could understand how to tell the story of what it is I know. So, can you talk about how your approach as a journalist differs from that of a researcher?
Yeah, I do also feel the similarity, and I often see, opportunities for things like early career ocean researchers. And I'm like, that's me, but they don't mean me. They mean a scientist, But I do in a lot of ways feel myself as a researcher. But I do think that as a journalist, I certainly don't have the same depth of knowledge that a researcher has. I probably can have some broader knowledge, but it's shallower, because researchers are often spending so much time. It's very niche, as I understand it. You kind of pick your research focus and you really, really go deep, maybe for years. I talk to the biologists who are maybe looking at a very specific kind of sponge for years in a postdoc or something like that. And so they get a real depth. And I think also, as a researcher, you're probably following the kind of related research and conversations. So you're also going to have some breadth. But as a journalist, I just don't have the same depth. There are sometimes programs for journalists where it's like, oh, go for a few weeks or a couple months or whatever, have the experience of being a scientist. You get to immerse yourself in like the research environment and learn how it works. And I haven't yet done something like that. I really want to, because I think I would benefit a lot from understanding more, how that research is done, how that depth is kind of plumbed.
Sort of wonder if as a journalist, you're demanded to learn things faster. I mean, the timescales that we operate on, anytime I have anything that I need to write, it's like I know about it a year in advance. And so I've got a year to learn enough to write something on this topic. Whereas journalists are often, you're writing things and you've obviously got a lot of attention to accurate representation. So I feel like learning quickly and learning the kind of the key elements, or at least the key elements. I'm very interested in how you choose what are the key elements that make a story. Like when you've got all this data or information in front of you, like you must be like sorting it to see how you can make a story out of it.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely envy y'all as researchers having more time on a story. But I think as a freelancer, I also have some of that privilege, whereas the staff writers have the super quick turnaround times on subjects that they maybe know nothing about. And that's how we get a lot of articles that kind of misrepresent deep sea mining. They're done by a staff writer who just spent the last, maybe 2 days, if they're lucky, on this story. And so as a freelancer, I'm able to dive a little bit deeper and spend a little more time researching and kind of chasing stories, following stories. And then when I'm like, okay, I have the story, I understand what it is, or it has developed enough into a story, now I can pitch it to a publication and hope that the editor wants it, or write about it in my newsletter for the things that I think might be a harder sell, but are still really interesting and important. But yeah, to figure out what the story is something I'm still kind of developing. I think a lot of it is intuition, and just as a person who reads a lot, both, books and shorter forms like news articles, you just kind of get an intuition for what makes the story. And it really depends. It's a case by case basis almost. But yeah, I think having a sort of scene or character or something that I can approach with a more creative lens to draw attention is something I'm trying to prioritize more and more, because I also really like the kind of nebulous think pieces that just, it's an essay, it explores an idea, it doesn't necessarily open in a place with a person. But those are definitely a very hard sell, both for readers and for editors. It's a lot easier and I think more traditional to go, okay, here is the journalistic report from this deep sea mining conference, for example. Here who was there, what was said, the major takeaways. That's kind of the traditional journalism. And it's easier to approach to just go, okay, I'm going to bring the reader into the room with me and let them know, the big picture takeaways from this conversation that happened that wasn't open to the public. So I'm trying to do more of that traditional approach and less of the very nebulous, like, let's explore an idea in this article. But yeah, it really depends.
That's so strange to me, because I feel like those think pieces are always what's interesting. And sometimes I get halfway through an article where it's like, and I kind of realize, oh, this is just kind of telling the story of, this afternoon that a journalist spent with a politician at a conference or something. And I always feel like there's nothing to that. There's not so much for me in that. I'm always...
it's probably best most of the time to blend the two in some way. If you can take a little from both the big picture, thoughtful exploration and the actual event that you attended, you might have a great piece of journalism.
Yeah. So, okay. So tell me more about this aspect of what it takes to get a story kind of accepted, both by readers, but especially by, like you've talked previously about editorial decisions and having to pitch stories to people whose kind of role is to gatekeep which of these stories are going to get out. So, I mean, just in as much detail as you want to give, because I'm sure that there's all sorts of, there's financial aspects, and maybe there's ideological aspects, and maybe there's just kind of practical, they know what is going to be read. But what is it that you have to think about when you're...
Yeah, it's definitely tough. And I think perhaps especially in the US journalism sphere, where, people have said for years, quote, if it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah.
And, there's this desire for really high conflict and drama, and also certainty and exactitude. And I mean, deep sea mining is controversial, but there's a ton of unknowns about it. And the conflict isn't always so very intense, I think, as editors want. I mean, I see this kind of pressure, and I see it happen in a lot of articles, as pressure to say something really intense, like deep sea mining will totally devastate oceans. And we can't really say that. We don't know. We could say it will damage some ecosystems, because mining damages ecosystems almost by definition, it's removing a part of the ecosystem. But I think editors are often wanting to push it a step further. And I think especially US editors. I don't notice it quite so much. I haven't worked as much with international publications. But for example, I've worked some with Cosmos, which is a science magazine in Australia. And they seem more interested in covering things even when there's less drama. And there's not quite as much of a push to make these really intense statements that might not be accurate, but they're kind of being made, I think, to get readers' attention. And I don't know that it's working, because we don't have a very engaged audience of news readers in the US. And so I think that's kind of my goal, is to do something different from what is being done and go, okay, even if there isn't this really intense conflict and this guaranteed devastation and this giant massive scientists protesting deep sea mining, all these things that are kind of said without being true in a lot of media coverage. Even without that, it's still really interesting. And I've seen examples of covering it in a different way that are very successful. There was one that was in a Norwegian paper, and I forget which one, and it was published in Norwegian. But it was basically a compare and contrast of a deep sea mining robot and a scientific research robot. And it had, of course, great pictures of the two robots, great descriptions of them. It kind of went back and forth between the two, like, oh, here's what they're both capable of, kind of almost personifying these robots and how they're going to go into the deep sea and what they can do there. And it didn't have a ton of conflict, but it was super interesting and very informative. You can add a lot of useful information, convey that to the reader in an article that's structured in such a creative way. And so I think bringing that kind of creativity into more of the press coverage would both attract more readers and make it more effective.
And it would mitigate some of the frustration that I hear from people who are involved, especially from the kind of like people who are involved in developing the mining technology, but I think also even the researchers. I've heard from people that the media portrays the topic as much more kind of fraught and full of conflict and extreme, and that's obviously very frustrating, and especially in the Norwegian context, where Norway is a really small country, and the whatever deep sea marine research / industry section of Norway is so small that all these people actually know each other quite well, or a lot of them know each other. And so the portrayal that they see of their kind of dynamics in the media is apparently doesn't always match their realities.
Yeah. I mean, you can go to, a deep sea conference in Bergen, for example, and see, even the environmental activists and the mining company executives, they can totally disagree and maybe argue on the stage a little bit, but then they'll still have a drink together afterwards. I think Norway has that room for kind of healthy conflict, and the media coverage doesn't always reflect that.
Do you ever is it the case that you will send, I mean, I know that you don't get to write your own headlines, that you'll write an article and then they'll try to put a salacious headline on it that over-represents, if not misrepresents, the content of the article. But you also just kind of get pushed back, like you'll send an article first draft and they'll say, well, put more blood and conflict into this. And
yeah, I mean, I don't know that I've had that quite happen yet, because it's usually in the pitch process where I'm pretty thoroughly conveying my angle and what I am and am not going to say. And if they're like, oh, this needs more conflict, then I'll probably be like, all right, then I won't sell the pitch to you because it doesn't have more conflict and I can't manufacture it. But yeah, definitely it's tricky with headlines. Also with images, editors are choosing images for the articles. And a lot of times, it's not quite the one that I would choose. It'll just be an image of like a boat on the ocean or, something that I feel is not super relevant. But I've seen, in other publications, and luckily this hasn't happened to me, at least not yet, where it'll be like an image of a tropical coral reef or something in an article deep sea mining, and it's like, deep sea mining is going to totally devastate the ocean. Look at all that's life, and it's like, there's life in the deep sea. You can find pictures of it. It's not going to look as lush and colorful in the picture for, the header of the article, but it's going to be a more accurate representation. Why not use that?
So you gave some examples of some of the narratives that you find problematic. I wonder, like you mentioned, like this need, like we need the minerals in order for the energy transition. Are there other narratives that you see being kind of like, do you see just like a general set of deep sea mining narratives that when you pick up an article, is it just like, oh, this is narrative 3 or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I don't quantify them quite so specifically, but yeah, I think so. I mean, I think probably the biggest one is the kind of like hyped up conflict between deep sea miners and environmentalists / scientists, which, yes, there is some conflict, but I just think there's this kind of, very simplified version of it that I see over and over again. And then maybe those articles seem to often side with the environmentalists and focus more on the potential devastation and things like that.
Yeah,
And then
big bad mining companies is an easy trope that people already have in their minds to
yeah,
make reference to.
yeah, it's interesting. I think deep sea mining, something about the idea of it just kind of maybe freaks people out a little bit, and it sounds very science fictional and kind of strange. And so there's just kind of, I don't know, inherent resistance is the right term, but it's kind of easy to play that up.
Mhm.
Yeah, or to paint, a mining company as a villain, which is, I don't know whether or not it's accurate. It's also kind of not a very interesting way to frame the story. I mean, in fiction, for example, a straightforward, uncomplicated villain who's just pure evil is really boring,
Yeah.
And something with more nuance, even if what they're doing is ultimately not the right choice, is more relatable, more fascinating, more human. So yeah, I think that's important to keep in mind.
So are there some voices or personalities or narratives that are kind of being drowned out or that you wish got more airtime?
Yeah, definitely. I think it would be interesting to hear more from the smaller deep sea mining companies because we hear from the metals company all the
Yeah.
time. Like, I don't know how they have so much time to talk to the press because they're not a very big company, but they're incredibly vocal. And I understand, it's very easy for a company to end up looking bad in the press. And so I understand this kind of hesitance and also the fact that most journalists haven't heard of the smaller companies, so they're maybe not even contacting them to make a comment. But I think it'd be really interesting and pertinent to hear more from the other companies in the deep sea mining space. I'd like to also, in terms of, I guess, topics and not sources, just see more kind of interrogation of the demand side, which I mentioned before. That's not every article is going to take the deepest dive into questioning various societies' use of resources. But yeah, just to be very cautious with terminology like this term critical minerals. What are they critical for? What does this term mean? It actually is kind of a political term. In the US, there's a specific governmental list of critical minerals, and a lot of them are critical because they're used in weapons and things like that.
It's absolutely a political term because every country has their own list and every country has their own definition. And in very few cases is that definition specifically defined. So like the European Union has a mathematical definition of what gets onto its critical mineral list, which is incredibly problematic, and they have a hard time sticking to it. They kind of like let other things slip in, even though it doesn't fit. But yeah, for example, Canada um, has a critical minerals list, and when you ask them, which I've done, how did these minerals get chosen to be the critical ones? They basically say, well, we talked to stakeholders and we decided that these are the important ones.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's different. I mean, yeah, and in some countries they're critical because they are necessary. Like you say, the U.S. is like these are the ones that if we lose access to these, not only will we struggle with whatever the new energy technologies, but we'll struggle to keep our defense systems working. Whereas in Canada, it's almost more like a marketing. It's like these are the minerals that we have that other countries want. So we're putting them up on this list and we're going to send out these like marketing brochures that say, look at all the critical minerals that Canada has. And we've identified that we've got all of these resources of our critical minerals list, which is exactly as the opposite
Yeah,
of the US's idea behind the definition of the term.
that's fascinating. Yeah, so I didn't know all of that. So all the more reason to be careful with just throwing the word critical minerals in an article. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned um, that it would be good to hear from some of the kind of smaller companies. So this podcast, I mean, I have a very Norwegian perspective on this. I can't actually name any of the smaller companies that aren't Norwegian. I know the Norwegian small companies, and I know the metals company, but I don't know basically what's going on in the rest of the world. So I wonder if you can do two things, because you've spent time in Norway, and so you've obviously got the US and I guess an international perspective, and then you've seen some of the Norwegian perspectives. And I wonder if you can contrast that a little bit, because Norway does get mentioned, even for an international audience. I think Norway is important because it's in some ways at least trying to be at the forefront of deep sea mining. But obviously Norway is a very unique country. So I wonder just if you can tell us how you see the Norwegian case, how it's different from the rest of the world, and then where, I mean, aside from the metals company and the Clarion Clipperton zone, where are the other kind of like places of interest that you're aware of in the deep sea mining space?
Yeah. So the Norwegian context is really interesting because, as I mentioned before, there's different types of deep sea mining. Polymetallic nodule mining is kind of the easiest one where you can kind of scoop them off the seafloor. And then there's mining the hydrothermal vents and the seamounts, where it's more like, removing these geological structures. And Norway doesn't have those polymetallic nodules on an abyssal plain. They have the vents and the seamounts. And that's kind of the hardest, least tested, least explored type of deep sea mining. Those two are the hardest ones. And also, Norway's potential area to open to deep sea mining is mostly in the Arctic. And so it's like they're doing something incredibly hard on hard mode or proposing to do it. It's very believable that Norway could do it because of, the experience, the technology, the history of also oil drilling and things like that. Norway is positioned to do those things where it's hard to name a whole lot of other countries that have that ability without bringing in outside companies that to bring the technology and the research and all of that. And so it's really fascinating. And sometimes I wonder, in the countries that are kind of racing to be first, if there's something of a race for clout, not just getting minerals, but getting the bragging rights of being the first to do it, to do this incredibly hard technological thing.
That's interesting because there is this kind of, big question of what the motivation is for Norway to be racing ahead so hard. Norway, by some accounts, has suffered politically, especially with other EU countries, which have kind of specifically and not so specifically threatened Norway because of the deep sea mining. I've even heard of people who are in EU-funded research projects where some of the other researchers will say, well, why are we having Norwegian research organizations in this project, which is completely unrelated to deep sea mining? They're just the fact that Norway has crossed some proverbial line, or is trying to anyway, seems to have washed back over them.
It's really interesting.
Quite negatively.
Yeah.
But so you say that there you see in some sense that there's like a positive framing on that to be the first to do this really difficult thing.
I mean, maybe I'm speculating, but I'm also there's also some discussion of like mining the moon, which is farther off potentially than deep sea mining, but would probably use kind of similar regulations. And it's like also a race. Countries are like, oh, we want to be the first.
Yeah,
it's quite silly in a lot of ways, but I was like, maybe something similar to that is happening with deep sea mining, where it's not just a race for resources, because it's a little bit silly to be like, oh, we really need these resources that are completely inaccessible without massive technological investment. That's a very illogical way to do things. But the kind of, the race for maybe admiration or accomplishment or something like that almost makes a little bit more logical sense.
Yeah. And I guess obviously I think some of the thinking is that if Norway can allow Norwegian companies to develop the technology first, then when other jurisdictions open, they will quite naturally invite these Norwegian companies with expertise to go and replicate. And so Norway will be exporting not only the minerals, but they'll be exporting the technology and the What about politically? Did you feel like, I don't know how much you followed, my perception also as an outsider to Norwegian society is that Norway is strange in how much social trust it has, especially coming from the North American context. And I actually kind of felt like this deep sea mining question was a little bit of an exception, where when you talk to the average Norwegian, express frustration with their government, which is much more rare here than back home in North America, where I feel like having people express frustration with their government is kind of par for the course.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I haven't got as solid of a grasp on Norwegian politics, but it is certainly interesting when, you look at it and how kind of reasonable it seems, obviously compared to the US, which is a pretty low bar to clear these days. But yeah, just kind of like there are these healthy debates happening and disagreement is not really quite so toxic. People are able to come together in a room and disagree and still, yeah, have a good conversation and learn from each other.
And
Yeah.
what's the status of the deep sea mining political conversation in the US?
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly a lot less attention to it in the US because there's just so much else going on and it's not really much on people's
Yeah.
radar aside from, kind of focused ocean environmentalists. And I do wish it was more. And one thing I want to do is cover more of the US situation because, in a sense, the US is actually exploring deep sea mining. It's just not with the same kind of formal process. So we have a government agency called the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and within that is the Marine Minerals Program. And they're formally exploring and quantifying seafloor minerals, not just for basic science, but for the prospect of someday possibly profiting off those minerals. That is what that group is designed to do, and that is what they're doing. Whether that will ever lead to formal deep sea mining in the US or not remains to be seen. There's at least one company, it's called Impossible Metals, pursuing the possibility of deep sea mining in the US seabed. They haven't succeeded yet. But, it's again so complicated because in every country it's very different. But I think there's sometimes a sense that it's not relevant to the US, but I feel that it really is.
And the US does have some what do you call that exclusive economic zone that is out in the Pacific and has the potential for nodule mining.
Yeah. I mean, in the waters off places like Hawaii, but also American Samoa, there's a lot of U.S. territories out there. There's potential minerals off the coast of Alaska. There's some off of the East Coast. I think it's called the Blake Plateau. And there's been some mineral resources found there. So there's definitely a lot. And the U.S. also has a pretty, advanced ocean technology to do this thing kind of in-house if it were to ever happen. There's already, a kind of policy framework for U.S. deep sea mining. There is already a formal process by which companies can apply for leases, and none of the leases have yet been approved by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. But the process is already there. So that's
Wow.
quite an interesting thing.
Oh, I wonder what's the difference then between where the US is and where Norway is. And do you hear in the US, like you described, sorry, I didn't catch the name of that Department of Marine Minerals or the Department.
The Marine Minerals Program in the
I just imagine that they're probably so much happier than the Norwegian version to be flying under the radar and not having everybody scrutinize every report they put out.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think they're quite deliberately flying under the radar. I mean, as a journalist, I'm kind of actively trying to get information about what they're doing and why. And they're quite reluctant, the representatives from that program are quite reluctant to go on the record and say,
yeah.
we're exploring deep sea minerals because we want to explore the possibility of someday, mining them. They are doing it, but they don't want to say it in a way that will allow me to quote them. So, it's understandable. They don't want the controversy. And I'm like, well, people do need to know about this.
Well, fascinating. And you say that they've got a framework for granting concessions essentially written up.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's, if it were to come to like commercial leasing, there would probably need to be new things written up. But at least for like exploration leasing, I believe, yeah, there's already a system by which leases are taken by that government agency and approved or denied. It's just that so far they've all been denied.
Oh, interesting.
Applications. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's exactly where Norway is trying to get to, the point where people can start applying for exploration licenses.
Yeah. I mean, Norway's doing it much more openly and with much more conversation and opportunities for education and public input. And, that doesn't guarantee the government will listen to that public input, but it's just a very different way of doing things.
Leading. Okay, and then aside from Norway and the US, and then obviously kind of the big international waters areas. Where are other hotspots? I think earlier you mentioned Japan.
Yeah, Japan has some form of exploration going. I don't know as well, but I know they've done like a test mine of a hydrothermal vent site, for example, which is pretty impressive to manage to do that. India has an exploration program where I think they recently opened to selling some leases. That's still kind of developing, what that story is going to be. China's doing a great deal of deep sea exploration.
Does China have some exclusive areas, or are they kind of out there finding other areas that they can explore in?
Yeah, that's a good question. China may have some, but I think they're also exploring in areas that maybe are kind of like under debate as to who owns them. There's a lot of kind of contested space in the deep sea where it's not officially, International Seabed Authority territory.
Yeah, and I've heard that China has the largest number of, I don't even know what they are. I guess there's some process of kind of claiming certain areas even within. Now, I'm not sure what I'm talking about, but I understood through the ISA that you could be granted an exclusive something to parcels of the seabed, and that China has the largest number of those. I will look into this and probably cut this section out of the podcast.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, and there's also the Cook Islands is actively doing a deep sea mining exploration program.
Right.
I think they're 3 years into it. Papua New Guinea has something kind of mysterious going on where they had some mining exploration that then was shut down. It didn't move forward a few years ago. Maybe it was like 10 years ago. But just recently, a mining ship showed up again and was doing some exploration work. And there was some debate over whether they had the right permits for that. Right. Exactly they're doing. Yeah. So it's different everywhere. I'm sure there's a couple other countries doing some deep sea mining stuff that I'm forgetting. And it's a little bit tricky because when you hear the kind of official governmental press releases, it's again a lot of PR. And unless you have experience in and with that country directly, it's a little bit hard to know what's really happening behind the curtain.
Yeah, for sure. Makes me wonder what, both with governments and with some of these bigger companies, like some of the big energy companies, have kind of these public statements that we're not going near deep sea mining or we support a moratorium. And I always think, well, that's easy to do right now while the technology kind of isn't developed and the economics isn't clear. Then you can just publicly support a moratorium until the day that they change their minds.
Yeah, exactly. A moratorium means kind of little because it can end whenever, basically.
Right. Okay. Well, then, yeah, I guess I'll start to wrap up. Do you have any comments on kind of the media's role? I'm not sure if this is a good question, but, in terms of deep sea mining is an ethically fraught topic with a lot of kind of public scrutiny. And how do you think about the media's responsibility and responsibility in covering and bringing information to the public and by kind of informing the public accurately?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I think this almost gets into questions of what is the media's role these days in general. Clearly the modern media approach, at least in the US, is largely failing, and it's sort of hyperbolic, and yet people don't even want to look at it. And so there's the real need for shifts, and certainly that's true also in the coverage of deep sea mining. I think it's important to, focus on getting people's attention and giving them accurate information. That's always the goal of the media. But I think the way to do it is, as I've said, not to have this like kind of intense manufactured conflict or even this very extreme kind of opinionated stance. I think even for, journalists who are against deep sea mining, which I would say that I am, but I don't think it's good to go, oh, this article is all about how deep sea mining is bad and you should hate it. I don't think that's helpful. And I also don't think that would convince anyone anyway. I think you really just have to kind of find creative, interesting, and accurate ways to look at different aspects of the problem. I think the time for the big deep sea mining explainer, the what is deep sea mining article is kind of over. It's gotten too complicated, and those articles are already out there. So yeah, I want to see more creativity. Like I mentioned in that piece in the Norwegian news, where it was just like, here's the two robots, here's how they're the same and here's how they're different, one for deep sea mining, one for scientific research. It's like, that's a great approach. And I'd like to see more of that creativity and specificity and nuance. And I think, it's a little bit hard. I think journalists need to be given a little bit more room to explore and be creative and take risks and do different kinds of stories that maybe haven't been proven to be successful, to get a lot of clicks or whatever. But, what we're doing right now, at least in the US media, is clearly not working. And so I think there needs to be some more exploration. And deep sea mining is a great thing to do that with, because it is interesting and weird and new, and there's many different ways to cover it.
Yeah, well, I certainly second that desire for more nuance and detail and stories that aren't just kind of the recap of the broad narrative and how the various actors have manifested their conflict most recently, but bringing in more of the different details. Do you have any advice for consumers of news about how, personally, I get most of my news on my smartphone through some kind of algorithm that I don't even know. It knows that I'm interested in deep sea mining, and so it gives me a whole bunch of stories from probably the main kind of the big news organizations. But if I wanted to get more stories from people like you, get more of the details, get less of the overarching narratives, is there strategies that you can kind of advise?
Yeah, what I've done is to set up a Google alert for all the related terms, deep sea mining, seabed mining, seafloor mining, and I just get an email once a day with all of the results that had those kind of keywords flagged by Google. And it's really not overwhelming, because at least in English, there's not a ton of coverage of deep sea mining, but it's always an interesting roundup because it catches not just the kind of big major newspaper coverage, but also the press releases from the mining companies, the press releases from the environmental groups, the kind of niche, smaller. I don't think it actually gets anything from blogs or like Substacks, but smaller people who are covering it, who you might not find out about otherwise, tend to show up there. There's a helpful website called Southern Fried Science that covers deep sea mining. Southern Fried Science. Yeah. And so they cover a number of different scientific things. It's kind of a fun, playful, silly explainer website of like science and the media and understanding it and the inaccuracies. But a deep sea ecologist named Andrew Thaler covers deep sea mining over there and is super knowledgeable about it, has followed it for a long, long time and written about it for a long, long time. And it's quite engaging, and it's definitely not the kind of stuff that you'll see in the major newspapers. And that's been a great resource. But you can find like that through, maybe the Google alert is not for everyone. It's a super nerdy deep dive, but it does turn up interesting things.
Well, it certainly is a hack to get around the algorithms, where you just kind of get everything and then you can sort through and decide which sources you're interested in. And kind of prioritizing. And then you mentioned the kind of, the public relations pieces masquerading as news. Is that a big kind of pitfall to watch out for in the deep sea mining space? Like, are there a lot of news stories that are actually put out either by the pro or the anti side?
I don't think that's happening quite so much yet, at least not in this very insidious way, but I do think it's important to be aware as a consumer of the media what you're looking at. It's certainly possible for someone who's not thinking deeply about what they're reading to read a press release from a company and not notice the part where it says press release at the top, because they're kind of written in a similar way as a news article. Or, there's a long-standing and healthy tradition of publishing opinion pieces in major newspapers, but you do have to carefully read, where it says opinion at the top and see, okay, who's writing this? Whose opinion is this? Kind of critically evaluate it. But I don't think the kind of deep sea mining marketing or the anti-deep sea mining marketing is yet, taking up space with articles or ads that look like articles and things like that. I think that's more in a kind of like traditional consumer marketing sphere. I haven't seen that from deep sea mining stuff yet.
What are the newspapers obviously aren't going to publish opinion pieces that are just full of inaccuracies, but at the same time, they're not going to expect expect the same kind of standards as they would if it was a news piece. I'm not sure how to make that into a question.
Yeah,
Is it the case that people can just write whatever they want into an opinion piece, and if they can get it past the editor, then that's all systems go?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps theoretically, but I think a responsible newspaper is generally evaluating where the opinion's coming from and looking for some kind of substantiation. If you pitch an opinion piece to a major newspaper, they want to know that you're some sort of expert usually. So you, as a researcher, could easily pitch an opinion piece on deep sea mining and probably get it accepted, because you were like, my opinion is based on this expertise. It's a lot harder for someone without some sort of a platform, some sort of background knowledge to get their opinion pieces accepted. And then usually the opinion piece is still probably going to go through an editing process a little bit, which is not the case with something like a letter to an editor where it's just published as is. But usually the opinion pieces still go through, a round of editing, and they're maybe looking for like, okay, you make this claim, but what is your supporting evidence? So yeah, I mean, maybe at a smaller, less well-resourced or less ethical paper, though, things could slip through the cracks.
I know for me, it's often, the newspapers seem to have, they have a political slant. And so often I'll read the headline and then I'll look to see which newspaper it's coming from and just look for the correlation between those things.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's important to evaluate where things are coming from.
Okay, well, I feel like I've taken quite a lot of your time today, so thanks very much. Can you remind people where they can look for your pieces?
Yes, yeah. So following my newsletter, will help you get the information without having to do the whole Google alert and go through all the news articles, so you don't have to. It's called Notes from the Deep. If you go to notesfromthedeep.substack.com, you'll find it. Or you can probably just search Substack for Notes from the Deep. Yeah, and so I try to make it easy and interesting to follow all this stuff.
And do you have any upcoming pieces on deep sea mining that you're working on?
I don't have anything on deep sea mining specifically. I do have one that probably won't be out for a little while because it's in a print publication. That's with Cosmos, the Australian science magazine, and it's about kind of new ways to research deep sea life, and especially the very fragile and gelatinous deep sea life, where we really don't know much about it, because even if you get a sample and you pull it to the surface, it's going to look totally wrong. It's been totally destroyed by the process of taking the sample. So It's about, knowledge that could help inform the deep sea mining debate, but it's not about deep sea mining specifically.
Well, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. But I'm hoping to have more, now that the US elections are over and that big kind of journalism space could perhaps be devoted to some other things. I'm hoping there will be more to come. Lots more to come.
Great. Okay. Well, I hope that also, and I hope that you are at the forefront of reporting on these things. And thanks a lot for taking the time to explain all of this to me and hopefully to our listeners. Do you have anything else that you want to mention before we sign off?
I don't think so. No, but thank you for an interesting conversation. I'm such a nerd about this whole deep sea mining thing, and it's very rare that I can just talk about it with someone who's not like, what even is that? But I'm always happy to explain it to people too, but it's always fun to go deeper.
Well, great. Hopefully we can do it again and go a bit deeper next time. Okay, well then I'll just remind everyone to follow Elyse on Notes from the Deep on Substack.com. And thanks.
All right. Thank you.